Right, well, thank you. Good morning. As Tim indicated, the talks today are going to be short and fairly precise. This is an attempt to give an overview, a summary overview of UK government's food policy. And the theme of it is really to look at the notion of to what extent have we been able to integrate food policy across different policy sectors. Attempts were made at this in recent years under the Labour government. This seems to be falling away again now under the current coalition government. So under the title of Where is Food Policy Going, this is an attempt to look at our national situation. Three things I want to look at then, some of the key features that shaped government food policy. I'm going to focus particularly on the UK, obviously, but within that I mean England primarily. Others hopefully will look at some of the more regional devolved dimensions. I'm going to look at how the UK government came to formulate a more integrated food policy, particularly around the Food Matters and Food 2030 vision reports, and also look at some of the policy actions of the coalition government over the last 18 months. And by coincidence, I gave a talk to the National Onion and Carrot Conference 3 weeks ago. I'm extending that a bit because actually I did the Onion Day, but the Carrot Day was next. But I did share a platform with Jim Pace, the Agriculture Minister, so I've got some idea of some of the thinking of government from that dimension at least, from first hand. In terms of framing policy reforms, if you take a longer term view over the last decade or more, really picking up from the late 1990s, I think this is a rather long list here, but let me just rattle through it quickly of what I think have been key things which have emerged, which were in place in the late 90s and some of which have emerged since. First of all, international trade liberalisation. One of the key things which government were concerned about was to make UK farming internationally competitive. And the other key thing is to keep prices low. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, the 2000s then, they want to keep prices low, to keep inflation low. Food supply security was to be achieved through open and competitive markets as part of that trade liberalisation. But under the banner of the WTO Agriculture Agreement, Green Box compliance meant that common agricultural policy reform supports would reward environmental and public goods. Also, there was a definite move by the government in the late 1990s to move to better consumer advice over food. This was in the wake of the food safety scandal, some of which will be covered in more detail later. And also the FSA was created to carry out that role, and it extended its role into nutrition advice as well. Around the food safety scandal, there was a definite priority to reaffirm trust in production. A reconnection with producers' consumers was one of the key phrases that came out of the Curry Commission policy review at the beginning of the decade of the 2000s. The external costs of diet-related health emerged, and strategies began to evolve in government for that. And the other question which came increasingly apparent, I think, was the resilience of our supply base, particularly on environmental grounds. And these are just some examples: energy inputs, natural resource depletion, weather volatility, but also demand factors like population growth and urbanisation, and moves towards nutrition transition in developing countries. Within this, we see a move to more policy integration. This came back with Food Matters exercise and the report in 2008. And this was one of the first attempt, actually, by Gordon Brown as the new Prime Minister to use his Prime Minister's strategy unit to look at some blue skies thinking on a policy issue. And in this case, they alighted on food and food policy. And here the concern was there was an awareness that there was a new politics of food in society in the UK that was essentially below the policy radar. In particular, health, environmental and ethical concerns were arising in this public discourse. At the time of this, we also saw the food price hikes of international food commodities, and this led to a basically blue skies thinking strategy document, including policy recommendations, which in turn, of course, bring with them compromises around the cabinet table. There were 4 strategic food policy objectives from the Food Matters report when it was published in 2008. These are listed here. You can see fair prices, choice and access, improvement in the safety of food, healthier diet transition, and a more sustainable food chain. So an attempt to integrate what we would see as some of the priorities around food policy from the perspective of the centre, and importantly, to get more effective institutional mechanisms and means, strong arrangements in place to deal with these cross-cutting issues through government, both up and down and across. What has happened immediately after Food Matters under the Labour government were a range of structural changes. DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, became the lead department. It got a food chain cross-cabinet committee set up, and it was to lead on food issues. There was a new strategic objective for the department for a sustainable, secure and healthy food supply, and they set up a council of food policy advisors, of which Tim was a member, and other fellow travellers who are in the room, I think, also were on that. In travellers along the road to a more enlightened food policy. And also climate change was taken out of DEFRA and moved to the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So some important structural changes, but DEFRA really taking the lead. The other thing that was promised from Food Matters was a delivery of a food vision, which was to look towards what should be achieved in food policy by 2030, and this was underpinned by a range of indicators to measure progress towards a sustainable food system, and also a set of revived indicators around how secure our food supply was. In addition to this, the government introduced a food research and innovation strategy, and also the FSA led an integrated advice to consumers from its web platforms. This is DEFRA's depiction of the different factors coming to play. So we have the vision at the top, underpinned by the two indicators, food security underpinned by the assessment of food security, and the vision is the overall goal. The indicators are the direction of movement. This is Food 2030. What were the impacts of that period of activity? To quickly summarise, I would put them as following. The government had clearly examined the food sector in a much more rigorous way than before. Food Matters had a particular emphasis on the consumption end, particularly public health and sustainability, as well as consumption, but a particular consumption focus rather than production, which was a significant change in looking at how food policy was being looked at. They revisited food security and our national food supply. The strategic vision provided a clearer identification of trends and indicators, but if you read the document, it's largely, its form of action is largely around voluntary initiatives with industry. And there was an attempt at this more integrated approach institutionally for food policy. Also set in train during the period 2010, but reporting at the beginning of 2012, was the UK foresight on the future of food and farming, the UK food policy role in the global situation for feeding the world. And these are the key challenges I identified. And these, of course, illustrate the rise to prominence of the resilience issues of the environmental natural resource shortcomings. Now, to move to the current last 18 months, what have we seen with the change of government? Well, I would summarise it as a redirection in food policy in the following ways. The first, an overriding theme which comes up all the time, is a focus on production, a greater support for producers and farmers led by DEFRA now. The food industry is given a key role in public health delivery, for example, and you'll be familiar with the voluntary responsibility deals, which cover food and alcohol, amongst other topics. Nutrition was removed from the Food Standards Agency to Department of Health. The integrated advice to consumers was closed, so that consumer-led approach from the FSA has been diminished. And of course, we know the overriding narrative for the first year was the austerity, or the last first 6 months certainly was the austerity and budget deficit reduction. And we see various agencies removed, or the policy role of environmental agencies removed, and some regional delivery bodies taken away. So we see a dismantling of some of the policy delivery mechanisms that have been put in place over the previous decade or so. DEFRA as an industry promotion, DEFRA, as I say, now becomes an industry sector promotion body to promote the interests of British producers in feeding the world. And here DEFRA has taken up very keenly the notion of sustainable intensification, which was put forward in the Royal Society report, really led by the life sciences as a way to tackle the global problems of feeding the world and sustainability. The food vision itself, well, that's fading away. It hasn't, I think it'll probably disappear altogether next year, but it's getting very blurred. What's being replaced by, in official speak, is the Foresight report is replacing it very clearly. I've heard it referred to by Minister as the Bible for how we deal with future problems. And the issue here, of course, is that actually that's got a 2050 time horizon rather than 2030. So I think that's something that I'm certainly identifying. What we also have seen is a natural environment white paper, which has been quite well received. Within that, there is an attempt to try and look how to continue to tackle how to resolve food production and environmental impact. And the Green Food Project has set up a steering board to look at this, how to reconcile these things. But again, this is taking a longer term range. Again, the time horizon that I've heard spoken about is 2050. Although if that's not the case, I'd be happy to have that corrected. DEFRA itself is undergoing internal reform. Some of the things set up in 2008, 2010 have gone or are going. This is part of the response to the budget cuts, but also to a reorientation of priorities. This is an example of what DEFRA did under the new government in the first year it was in operation. This is a structural reform plan, and these are some of the initiatives which they engaged in as their key policy milestones. So promoting increased UK production. They included introducing government department buying standards, which is a half glass, half full for many of us who have been involved in monitoring public procurement of sustainable food over the recent years. The adjudicator has been set up to monitor and enforce grocery supply code of practice. That process, it hasn't actually been set up, it's in the process of being set up, of course, legislated, but we are concerned there is a lack of teeth for that ombudsman. There was a voluntary initiative to encourage more information about the origins of UK food, which is a concern of UK meat producers in particular. The retailers' agreement was set up at the end of last year. But anyway, today is the day, by the way, the new food labelling regulations come into force. So that's the food information regulation, which includes origins of food under its regulation. And that's an example, of course, that actually regulation takes place at the EU level rather than the UK. One of the other objectives was a new animal welfare regime, again an EU responsibility taking place there, and also to revise and simplify some of the cross-compliance regulations by which farming supports are received, and an industry-led farming regulation task force reported in May of this year. Just to reinforce the fact that multi-level governance remains, I'm sure David Cameron's aware of these figures, but just in case he isn't, the EU is currently over 90% self-sufficient agricultural products by farm gate value, and that's how we measure them, I'm afraid. We don't measure them by volume, we don't measure them by calories, we don't measure them by nutritious components, we measure them by economic value. The EU takes 80% of our food exports. Our imports, we get 57% of unprocessed value, 69% of added value from the EU. So we're very much in a European market, let us not forget that, and it is, of course, the main regulatory arena. There's a lot going on beyond the national level. Multi-level governance means there's a lot going on at devolved and regional levels, and, of course, at local levels amongst local governments. That will be covered elsewhere today. The debate around policy, really what we've seen in these different documents is a different emphasis upon different policy instruments. Regulation, should it be framing or should it be more specific? Should we set targets, indicators, voluntary actions? Should that be the way to work with industry to achieve these targets? Where do financial supports and inducements lie? What should they be? Who should they go to? How should they relate to sustainability standards? Labelling information becomes very important and is still increasingly relied upon, and I suspect fragile policy instrument to use for our needs in the future. R&D and translational research is very important. Fiscal instruments, limited to date, but of course the use of selective taxes around food issues has been mooted and tried elsewhere. Education and skills relates to the research design and translational research. So finally, my conclusions, to set the tone for the morning, at least from the national standpoint, is where are we at the moment? We've got a clear identification of the scope of food policy and its key elements has come from government. That has been done. There's been a lot of activity, but less action, I would suggest. We did have a plan emerging. We don't. That's fading away. So we'll have to call Baldrick back again to give us some clues. The new government, I think we see some continuity, and I think there is continuity there of thinking, but there is some policy reversal, I would say confinement, a move away from integration to a more confined policy space around specific policy issues and delivery. And finally, I think what we can see from the recent years is that the food sector and food policy needs strategic government-led interventions, both now and for the longer term. And to give one example of this, which I haven't had time to mention yet, I think if you went back and look at the Fruit and Vegetable Task Force recommendations, which came out of the Council of Food Policy Advisors, one of the last things they did, and they were actually advising for the new government, because the new government was in place then, that was in August of last year, you see a very interesting combination of interventions being suggested, and that was a cross-sector, cross-state, civil society and industry body which investigated the fruit and vegetable sector. And I think that's the sort of thinking that we need to take through the future.
David, very good.